What's up, my fellow Shield Brothers? It's your Shield Brother here, back for the History Armada once again with our episode 4 of our weekly adventure, A History of the Germanic States. This week we're going to pick up right where we picked up left off last time, right in 1763, and we're going to begin with Prussia and its large effects on the surrounding Germanic states and how that kind of escalated and evolved the surrounding area. So after 1763, Prussia became a European great power. They rivaled between Austria and Prussia for the leadership of the Germanic states, and this rivalry, this kind of sibling rivalry, would dictate and kind of guide the rest of Germanic history very thoroughly. So from 1640, Brandenburg Prussia had started to rise under the Great Elector Frederick William. The Peace of Westphalia in 1648 strengthened it even further through the acquisition of East Pomerania. From 1713 to 1740, King Frederick William I, also known as the Soldier King, established a highly centralized, militarized state with heavily rural population of about 3 million compared to the 9 million in Austria. In terms of boundaries, in 1914, Germany in 1700 had a population of 16 million, increasing slightly to 17 million by 1750. And growing more rapidly to 24 million people by 1800. Wars continued, but they were no longer so devastating to the civilian population. Famines and major epidemics did not occur, unlike last episode where we talked about the famines, epidemic, and mass migration that would happen due to the Germanic Wars. So, although this did not occur anymore, increased agricultural productivity led to a higher birth rate due to the lack of devastating after effects, and also a much lower death rate occurred under the newly formed Prussian government and its lesser effects. So that does bring us to the wars. So King Louis XIV of France conquered parts of Alsace and Lorraine, and had invaded and devastated the electorate of the Palatine. So, in the War of Palatine Succession, Louis XIV benefited from the empire's problems with the Turks, which were menacing Austria. Louis XIV ultimately had to relinquish the electorate of Palatine. Afterwards, Hungary was reconquered by the Turks. Austria, under the Habsburgs, developed into a great power at this time. Frederick II, the Great, as you might know him, Frederick the Great, of Prussia, reigned from 1740 to 1786, and he's pictured on your left. Frederick II the Great is best known for his military genius and his master use of maneuvers, his reorganization of Prussian armies, and his battlefield success, and his enlightened rule, and especially his making Prussia one of the great powers of Europe, as well as escaping from almost certain national disaster at the very last minute. He was especially a role model from a aggressively expanding Germany down to 1945 even. And even today, he remains as a heroic image in Germany. In the War of Austrian Succession from 1740 to 1748, Maria Theresa fought successfully for recognition of her successor to the throne. But in the Silesian Wars and the 7 Years' War, she had to cede 95% of Silesia to Frederick the Great. After the Peace of Hubertsburg in 1763 between Austria, Prussia, and Saxony, Prussia won recognition as a great power, thus launching a century-long rivalry between Austria and Prussia for the leadership of the Germanic peoples. From 1763, resistance from the nobility and citizenry of enlightened absolutism was established in Prussia and Austria, according to which the ruler governed accordingly to the best precepts of the philosophers. The economies developed and legal reforms were undertaken, including the abolition of torture and the improvement in the status of Jews due to these wars and the new Enlightenment. Emancipation of the peasants slowly began to become the norm. Compulsory education was instituted. In 1772 to 1795, Prussia took the lead in the partitions of Poland, with Austria and Russia splitting the rest. Prussia occupied western territories of the former Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth that surrounded existing Prussian holdings. Poland again wouldn't be independent again until 1918 due to its loss in this war. So that kind of brings us to the smaller Germanic states. So completely overshadowed by Prussia and Austria, according to historian Hajo Holborn, The smaller German states were generally characterized by political lethargy and administrative inefficiency, often compounded by rulers who were more concerned with their mistresses and their hunting dogs than with the affairs of the states. Bavaria was especially unfortunate in this regard. It was a rural land with very heavy debts and few growth centers. Saxony was in economically good shape, though its government was seriously mismanaged, and numerous wars had taken its toll on Saxony. During the time when Prussia rose rapidly within the Germanic states, Saxony was distracted by foreign affairs. The House of Witten concentrated on acquiring and then holding on to the Polish throne, which was ultimately unsuccessful. In Württemberg, the Duke lavished funds on palaces, mistresses, great celebrations, and hunting expeditions, wasting the state's funds. Many of the city-states of Germany were run by bishops, who in reality were for powerful noble families and showed scant interest in religion. None developed a significant reputation for good government. In Hesse-Kassel, the Landgrave Frederick II ruled 1760 to 1785 as an enlightened despot and raised money by renting soldiers called Hessians to Great Britain and other powers to help fight in wars such as the American Revolution. He combined Enlightenment ideas with Christian values, cameralist plans for central control of the economy, and a militaristic approach towards diplomacy. Hanover did not have to support a lavish court. Its rulers were also kings of England and resided in London. George III, elector ruler from 1760 to 1820, never once visited Hanover. The local nobility who ran the country opened the University of Göttingen in 1733. It soon became a world-class intellectual center. Baden sported perhaps the best government of these smaller states. Karl Frederick ruled well for 73 years and was an enthusiast of the Enlightenment going on. He abolished serfdom in 1783. The smaller states failed to form coalitions with each other and were eventually overwhelmed by powers such as Prussia. Between 1807 and 1871, Prussia swallowed up many of these smaller states. With minimal protest, they went on to found the German Empire. In the process, Prussia became too heterogeneous and it lost its identity, and by the 1930s had become an administrative shell of its little importance. But that also brings us to the nobility. So, in a heavily agrarian society, land ownership played a central role, and Germany's nobles, especially those in the east called Junkers, dominated not only the localites but also the Prussian court, and especially the Prussian army. Increasingly, after 1815, a centralized Prussian government based in Berlin took over the powers of the nobles, which in terms of control over the peasantry had been almost absolute. To help the noble avoid indebtedness, Berlin set up a credit institution to provide capital loans in 1809, kind of revolutionizing the way that it worked. The Junker nobility controlled the army and the navy, the bureaucracy, and the royal court. They generally set government policies and the pace for what the government was going to run at. And you can see how that can be very dangerous for these smaller Germanic states as well as the larger ones. So to talk about the peasants and their rural life. Peasants continued to center their lives in villages where they were members of a corporate body and to help manage the community resources and monitor the community life together. In the east, they were serfs who were bound permanently to parcels of land. In most of Germany, farming was handled by tenant farmers, who paid rent and obligatory services to their landlords, who was typically a nobleman. Peasant leaders supervised the fields and ditches and grazing rights, maintained public order and morals, and supported a village court which handled minor offenses. Inside the family, the patriarch made all the decisions for these peasants and tried to arrange advantageous marriages to other peasant families for his children. Much of the village's communal life centered around church services and holy days. In Prussia, the peasants drew lots to choose conscripts required by the army. The noblemen handled external relationships and politics for the village under their control, and were not typically involved in daily activities or decisions. So, the emancipation of the serfs came in 1770 to 1830. Beginning with Schleswig in 1780, the peasants were now ex-serfs and could own their own land, buy and sell it, and move about freely for once. The nobles approved of now they could buy land and owned by the peasants. The chief reformer was Baron von Stein, who was influenced by the Enlightenment, especially the free market ideas of Adam Smith. The end of serfdom raised the personal legal status of all the peasantry. A bank was set up so that the landowners could borrow government money to buy land from the peasants. The peasants were not allowed to use it to borrow money to buy land until 1850. The result was the large landowners obtained even larger estates, and many peasants became landless tenants, or moved to the cities or to America. The other German states imitated Prussia after 1815. In sharp contrast to the violence that characterized land reform in the French Revolution, Germany handled it peacefully. In Schleswig, the peasants who had been influenced by the Enlightenment played an active role. Elsewhere, they were largely passive. Indeed, for most peasants, customs and traditions continue largely unchanged, including the old habits of deference to the nobles, whose legal authority remained quite strong over the villagers. Although the peasants were no longer tied to the same land as serfs had been, the old paternalistic relationship of East Prussia lasted until the 20th century. So you can see how the Enlightenment really changed life for not only the nobles but also the peasantry. The agrarian reforms in northwestern Germany in the era of roughly 1770 to 1870 were driven by progressive governments and local elites. They abolished feudal obligations and divided collectively owned common land into private parcels, thus creating a more efficient market-oriented rural economy and community, which increased productivity and population growth and strengthened the traditional social order because wealthy peasants obtained most of the former common land, while the rural proletariat was left without land. Many left for the cities or America again. Meanwhile, the division of the common land served as a buffer, preserving social peace between the nobles and its peasants. In the East, the serfs were emancipated by the younger class, maintained its large estates, and monopolized political power off of these new peasantry. Around 1800-ish, the Catholic monasteries, which had large land holdings throughout what had been the Holy Roman Empire, were nationalized and sold off by the government. In Bavaria, they had controlled 56% of the land, which was sold off to the peasantry and the nobility. So, speaking of the Enlightenment, it brings us to what that really meant. So, before 1750, the German upper classes looked to France for its intellectual and cultural and architectural leadership. French was the language of high society. By the mid-18th century, the German word for Aufklärung had transformed German high culture in music, philosophy, science, and literature. Christian Wolff was the pioneer as a writer who expounded the Enlightenment to German readers. He legitimized German as a philosophic language. Before that, it had not been really considered that, so it was only French that was really seen as, the upper language, like the intellectual language. If you were smart, if you were nobility, you spoke French. But due to the Enlightenment and people such as Christian Wolff, German also started to rise in rank, and more people began to increasingly and more proudly speak German as a noble language. Prussia took the lead among the German states in sponsoring the political reforms that Enlightenment thinkers urged absolute rulers to adopt. However, there were important movements as well in the smaller states such as Bavaria, Saxony, and Hanover, and the Palatine. In each case, Enlightenment values became accepted and led to significant political and administrative reforms that laid the groundwork for the creation of its modern states. So, the princes of Saxony, for example, carried out an impressive series of fundamental, fiscal, administrative, judicial, educational, cultural, and even general economic reforms due to the Enlightenment. So you can see how the Enlightenment, especially the German Enlightenment, won the support of princes, aristocrats, and the middle classes, and even the peasantry, and it permanently reshaped the German culture, and how that was so important during this time that our episode is on, that really would affect the evolution of the Germanic States. So, The bourgeois values rapidly spread to rural Germany. So a major social change occurred between 1750 and 1850, depending on region, was the end of the traditional whole house system, in which the owner's house lived together in one large building with the servants and craftsmen he employed. They reorganized into separate living arrangements. No longer did a owner's wife take charge of all the females that worked for him in profit-oriented manner. They managed the fields and the household exterior according to what dictates to which strict standards of cleanliness, order, and a thrift applied. The result was the spread of formerly urban bourgeois values into rural areas of Germany. The lesser families were now living separately on wages instead of in one large house together. So they had to provide for their own supervision and schooling and health. So furthermore, the working classes, the middle classes, and the upper classes even became physically, psychologically, and politically more separate. They drifted away from one another. This allowed for the emergence of working class organizations. It also allowed for declining religiosity among the working class, who were no longer monitored on a daily basis. So the bourgeois values that came with the Enlightenment also changed how the everyday German lived their life. No longer did they have the same old large house system, but they all live separately now on their own means, depending on class and their job. So that brings us to the French Revolution. And the German reaction to the French Revolution was mixed. It was very conflicted on what they thought of it. German intellectuals celebrated the outbreak, hoping to see triumph of reason and the Enlightenment. The royal courts in Vienna and Berlin denounced the overthrow of the king and threatened spread of notions of liberty, equality, and fraternity. By 1793, the execution of the French king and the onset of the Terror disillusioned the educated middle class of the Germans. Reformers said the solution was to have faith in the ability of Germans to reform their own laws and institutions in peaceful fashion. So there was really two views to this French Revolution going on. The one half was that it was evil. It was these upper class and these nobles that were frightened by this because they saw the execution of the French king, which was unheard of for a king to be executed practically, because it had only happened a handful of times, and it frightened them. But on the other hand, these educated middle class people saw this as a chance to reform their own German laws in such a way that would bring out liberty and equality. And Europe was racked by 2 decades of war revolving around France's efforts to spread its revolutionary ideals and the opposition of reactionary royalty, who were afraid of this change. War broke out in 1792 as Austria and Prussia invaded France, but were defeated at the Battle of Valmy. The German lands saw armies marching back and forth, bringing devastation yet again, albeit on a far lower scale than the 30 Years' War had brought, almost 2 centuries before, but also bringing new ideas of liberty and civil rights to the German peoples. Prussia and Austria ended their failed wars with France, but with Russia partitioned Poland among themselves. The French took control of the Rhineland, imposed French-style reforms, abolished feudalism and established constitutions, promoted freedom of religion, emancipated the Jews, opened the bureaucracy to ordinary citizens of talent, and forced the nobility to share their power with the rising middle class. Napoleon created the Kingdom of Westphalia as a model state, which lasted from 1807 to 1813. These reforms proved largely permanent and modernized the western parts of Germany. When the French tried to impose the French language, German opposition grew rapidly in intensity. So a second coalition of Britain, Russia, and Austria then attacked France, but failed again. Napoleon established direct or indirect control over most of Western Europe, including the Germanic States. Apart from Prussia and Austria, the old Holy Roman Empire was little more than a farce now. Napoleon simply abolished it in 1806. So here we see the death of our Holy Roman Emperor, which we have seen in the past 4 episodes. The old Holy Roman Empire, now abolished in 1806, in Germany, Napoleon set up the Confederation of the Rhine, comprising most of the German states except for Prussia and Austria into one entity. Prussia tried to remain neutral while imposing tight controls on dissent, but with German nationalism sharply on the rise, the small nation blundered by going to war with Napoleon in 1806. Its economy was weak, its leadership was poor, and the once mighty Prussian army was a hollow shell of itself. Napoleon easily crushed it at the Battle of Jena. Napoleon occupied Berlin, and Prussia paid for it dearly. Prussia lost its recent acquired territories in western Germany, its army was reduced down to only 42,000 men, no trade was allowed with Great Britain, and Berlin had to pay a heavy reparation and tax to Berlin, and the French army was allowed to occupy the German states, and not only that, but Prussia had to fund it. Russia had to fund its own occupation. And Saxony changed sides to support Napoleon, although originally siding with Prussia, and joined his Confederation of the Rhine. Its elector was rewarded with the title of King of Saxony and given a slice of Poland taken from Prussia. After Napoleon's fiasco in Russia in 1812 causing his downfall, including the death of many Germans in his invasion army that had been conscripted, Prussia joined with Russia. Major battles followed in quick order, and when Austria switched sides to oppose Napoleon again, his situation grew very intense. He was defeated at the Battle of Leipzig in late 1813, and Napoleon's empire started to collapse. One after another, the Germanic States switched to oppose Napoleon, but he rejected peace terms. Allied armies invaded France in the early 1814, Paris fell, and in April Napoleon surrendered. He returned for 100 days in 1850, but is finally defeated by the British Army and German armies in Waterloo. Prussia was the big winner at the Vienna Peace Conference, gaining extensive amounts of territory and freedom over its control and sway of the surrounding smaller Germanic states. So, thank you so much for watching. This has been the Shield Brother, as you can see, back in my dorm for the History Armada. This has been episode 4. Tune in next week for episode 5, where I believe we're covering 1816 to 1867. And I'll catch y'all next time.